From KUOW in Seattle, welcome to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Today marks 2 years since Hamas and several other Palestinian militant groups carried out multiple coordinated attacks in Israel, killing over 1,000 people. Around 250 Israelis were taken hostage. It was a day of unconscionable atrocities and hatred, and war has only made the horrors grow. Israel's military campaign has killed more than 66,000 Palestinians, according to the United Nations. Last month, the UN Human Rights Commission declared that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. Locally, we see a lot of activism around America's support for Israel and American businesses' involvement in Israel and Gaza. But first, what do things look like in Israel right now? And will a ceasefire, if it happens, or the return of hostages, change the picture in Israel? Liora Halperin is a professor of international studies and history and distinguished endowed chair of Jewish studies at the University of Washington, and she is the director of the Interdisciplinary Ph.D. program in Near and Middle Eastern Studies. And she's here in studio with me to talk about the anniversary and the politics and cultural shift in Israel since October 7th. Thank you very much for being here, Liora.
Thank you for having me.
So we should start by mentioning you do have a connection to the attacks of October 7th because one of the victims was a former student of yours, Chaim Katzman, who was killed that day at his home in Israel. How are you thinking about that loss and marking today?
Yeah, I think it's hard to believe that it's been 2 years. It brings me back to that very personal entry point that I had, because the first I learned that something was unfolding was seeing a Facebook post that was shared from Chaim's mom. At first, suggesting that he had been taken hostage. Later, that would be updated, and it turned out he was killed on the spot. And even before I knew the scope of how devastating the attack had been, and before the response started to unfold on the part of the Israeli military, I was very personally deep in the shock, the horror, the mourning for Chaim, who had just finished his Ph.D. just over 2 years before the attack happened. And I think, like many people who have a personal connection, the personal connection becomes the grounding point. And it also becomes an opening for thinking in bigger ways about what's going on. And I think that's the case for Palestinians and Israelis and those with connections there. Right? It's not abstract. There's always a person or multiple people connected to the story.
Yeah. We're going to get into some more details about the cross pressures on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, what's going on with ceasefire negotiations now, which have started in Egypt this week. But first, when it comes to domestically perspectives of Israelis since October 7th, what has changed culturally and politically because of the attacks?
Well, I think one can't overemphasize how shocking the attacks were within Israeli society. And in Israeli society, across its diversity of populations, has experienced, Palestinian attacks as part of the experience of living in Israel. And so on one level, what happened that day reminded people of past traumas of smaller scales in the past. And older folks have more such traumas, younger folks perhaps fewer. But then it also feeds into a longer, let's say, collective memory of trauma, even among those who may not have experienced things in the past, including as far as memories of the Holocaust in the personal and the collective memory. So at first, Israeli society broadly was in a state of immense shock and immediate post-trauma. And the feelings of revenge, desire for revenge, emerged very swiftly and rapidly. And you heard that in some of the comments of Israeli officials who spoke of Hamas specifically, and then sometimes of Palestinians more generally, in really demonizing terms as human animals. I think that shock has not fully dissipated. And that's part of the story in Israeli society, is that that trauma was so large, and it also has been relived so many times, right? The culture, the media, on the local level, on the national level, has spent much of the last 2 years revisiting different parts of that trauma. But the politics have changed, with larger percentages of Israelis at first supporting a massive military response, irrespective of the hostage situation, right? Saying that as much as they wanted to prioritize the hostages, that in fact their larger priority was destroying Hamas, which was presented as the goal, possibly an unachievable goal, but nonetheless the goal that was stated. And as time has gone on, there are still some Israelis in some parts of the political spectrum who believe that the utter destruction of Hamas is achievable and is the goal, even at the expense of the hostages. But increasing numbers in Israeli society are saying that the war needs to end. Now, opinion polling in Israel has made clear that the reasons that most Israelis want the war to end have to do with Israel and Israelis. It's about concern for the hostages. It's about concern for the economic and social impacts of the war.
It's not about the death toll or the destruction in Gaza, is what you're saying.
That's right. That's right. So I think for folks who are following this from abroad, or who may be very deeply engaged with and shocked, horrified by what's happening, what Israel is doing in Gaza, to notice that most of Israeli society, and I should specify by saying Jewish Israeli society, that 80% or so who are Jewish, are not primarily motivated by concern for Palestinian deaths or suffering or starvation.
Are they shielded from it? Do you see it on Israeli media or on the nightly news? I mean, do they know the extent of what is happening just next door?
It's a good question, and it really speaks to the nature of the media and media silos. Certainly, all of that information is fully accessible and available, and most Israelis, especially younger Israelis, are on social media. But as we know, social media has its way of siloing people.
And reinforcing your priors.
That's right, reinforcing your priors. And so for most Israeli Jews, what they're seeing is the experience of Israeli soldiers, memories of Israeli civilians from October 7th, strategic considerations, the politics of the Netanyahu government. Does he or does he not want a ceasefire? They know about the massive protests that have been ongoing now for nearly the full 2-year period, calling for a ceasefire and the release of hostages. But only in smaller ways is the full scope of the destruction of Gaza, people, but also infrastructure, hospitals, farmland, and beyond becoming clear. But there are parts of Israeli Jewish society that are very, very attuned to it. And in fact, by virtue of their location, are able to be connected and engaged in a way that those of us abroad cannot be, who are engaged in protest, and not just against the government's failure to negotiate the release of hostages, but against the occupation more generally, right, in support of Palestinians more specifically. And many of those Israeli Jews are working in partnership in some way with that Palestinian minority in Israel, that 20 or so percent who are in and have been in a profoundly difficult situation. Many of them have friends and coworkers affected in Israel by October 7th. But because of the nature of Palestinian history, very likely have family in Gaza, family in the West Bank, whose villages have been under attack or threat by settlers and sometimes soldiers. So they find themselves feeling multiple types of trauma and pain, and also feeling a lot of fear for speaking out on behalf of Palestinians because of the chilling effect and the crackdown that has sometimes occurred against Palestinian citizens for doing so.
You mentioned earlier historic narratives and the attacks on October 7th bringing to mind the horrors of the Holocaust. And that is something that, you know, the foundation of Israel kind of rests on, is the idea of never again, that these attacks, pogroms against Jews, they would never happen. I was struck by a quote from Yuval Shani, a professor of international law at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He spoke to the New York Times about how today's violence in Gaza and also the October 7th attacks in Israel really reinforced these historical narratives that have created the entrenched polarization and conflict that we have today. And Shani said the October 7th slaughter and seizures of hostages reinforced Holocaust associations for Israel. And for many Palestinians in Gaza, the war has been a new Nakba, referencing the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians for the foundation of Israel. So narratives feed themselves in an endless loop. Do you feel like that's an accurate representation of where things are at?
Yeah, I think memory, both individual and collective, works in complex ways. The individual feeds into the collective, and then the collective feeds into the individual. Both Israeli and Palestinian society, though in different ways, are deeply marked and shaped by the experiences of the past. For Israelis, almost a split screen of a great amount of pride and excitement about the fact of the state of Israel and its various achievements, and also this ongoing existential fear that somehow the Jewish condition, which has been represented in Zionist memory as a really negative and sad one, is not in fact gone and can return at any time, and will return in particular sort of from that repressed that comes from below, that is the Palestinian society that existed in the land before the Zionist movement in Israel, that it'll come back up sort of through the cracks or from the margins or from the outside and endanger the state yet again. And so both that sense of strength and that, pride in the IDF that you hear, and on the other hand, this sense that it all seems incredibly fragile, which can be very shocking to hear from those who perceive Israel as a power, right? And it's a power within the region, and it's powerful because of the support the U.S. gives. But in that internal psyche, that feeling of real and potential weakness is always present. For Palestinians, absolutely. The number of people killed in this last 2 years far exceeds the number killed in the 1948 war period. The number displaced, and we don't know for sure how many of them will indeed be able to go back or will be permanently displaced, far exceeds the number displaced then. So in terms of individual human lives affected, it actually dwarfs 1948. But by the same token, the 1948 Nakba is the formative Palestinian moment, and for many initiated a much longer, slower process that some Palestinians call the ongoing Nakba, slower, more grinding processes of displacement, dispossession, fragmentation. So all of that comes to the surface, both the recent trauma for Palestinians, the ongoing trauma of ongoing bombings, ongoing losses that prevent Palestinians from entering a real post-trauma period, and then also for Israelis who in many ways have not been able to fully process what's been going on since October 7th because of the fact that the Netanyahu government has found ways to continue the war for this long.
You're listening to Soundside, and I'm Libby Denkman. And I'm speaking with Liora Halperin, professor of international studies and history and distinguished endowed chair of Jewish studies at the University of Washington. She's the director of the Interdisciplinary Ph.D. program in Near and Middle Eastern Studies at UW. And we're talking about the anniversary of October 7th and how it has changed Israel and U.S.-Israel relations in the 2 years since that attack. We'll continue this conversation in just a minute. Stick with us on KUOW. Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. We're continuing my conversation with Liora Halperin, who teaches history and Jewish studies at the University of Washington. And we've been discussing the 2-year anniversary of October 7th. Liora, President Trump has maintained vocal support of Israel while he's been putting pressure on Netanyahu and the Israeli government to have talks towards a ceasefire. He also told reporters that he thought Israel and Palestine both don't, quote, know what the F they are doing earlier this year. How do Israelis feel about President Trump?
Yeah, my understanding is that polling has shown that Israeli society uniquely, or maybe not absolutely uniquely, but is one of the few countries where there's more approval of Trump than disapproval of Trump. And that speaks to a perception among many Israelis that he is a diehard supporter of Israel, that he's brought in people in his cabinet, like Mike Huckabee, for example, who come from a Christian Zionist standpoint in their support of Israel. There's now been like town squares and streets and things named after Trump.
He moved the embassy.
That's right. So when he moved the embassy, that was something many Israelis cheered on. At the same time, I think there's some suspicion about whether he's truly a diehard supporter of Israel or if at the end of the day, he's just a self-interested person, which I think indeed he is, right? I think he's interested in achieving something that looks like a deal, which may in fact not satisfy most Israelis. And the fact that whatever deal happens, and I hope something happens soon, it's not going to address the fundamental issues that led to this in the first place. And so when Israelis turn around and realize that the fundamentals are still all there, that this threat has not been removed, in fact, could not have been removed even with this degree of military force, the disappointment and frustration will set in. And I suspect some of that will be directed towards Trump. But I think there's hope, especially for those who've been on the streets protesting for the hostages week after week. I think they're saying, well, maybe, Biden couldn't do it, but maybe Trump can. And they see him as the potential person who can come through.
Netanyahu specifically has really married himself to Trump as like a very close ally of the Trump administration, of President Trump specifically. And it strikes me that with prior U.S. presidents, Netanyahu maybe presented himself as like a defense or a bulwark against a shifting support for Israel or like pressure on Israel. Whereas with President Trump, he's sort of more proactively saying we're best friends. We are so close. Does that capture kind of Netanyahu's approach to this current president?
I think so. He certainly cozied himself up very closely, and Trump has become very close to Netanyahu on the other side. I think the reason Netanyahu particularly likes Trump is that Trump has cast to the sides this decades-long U.S. rhetoric about pushing for a two-state solution, which one can be very cynical about because, as we can see in retrospect, it did not, in fact, lead to a Palestinian state. But president after president, Republican and Democrat, until Trump was still holding that line, was not moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and so on. And Trump threw that out the window and says, I don't care about this international consensus. In fact, I don't really care about international processes or institutions at all. And so he is repeating and encouraging, affirming some of the discourse from Netanyahu's people about that there's no need for a Palestinian state, that should never and, need not ever happen. That makes Netanyahu certainly very happy.
Does it matter that President Trump, for example, is closely allied with the leadership of Qatar and other Arab nations? He has been much more open to negotiations. He's made a big push with both business deals and diplomatic deals with Arab nations. And on the same sort of train of thought, that there is a big collection of MAGA supporters who are highly skeptical of Israel. So while the perception of Trump within Israel may be that he is, maybe the best friend to that country that the U.S. has ever produced, it actually seems from a U.S. perspective that Trump has a lot of kind of cross currents in how he approaches Israel. I mean, does that matter in, the future of U.S. and Israeli relations, do you think?
Well, I think there are a lot of sea changes going on now in U.S. politics with respect to Israel. Perhaps the most important being that increasing parts of the Democratic Party no longer express support for Israel as a primary objective. And in fact, growing numbers of Democrats, especially younger Democrats, polling has showed, when asked if it's like one or the other, say they support Palestinians or support pausing or halting weapons sales to Israel, support using terms like genocide to describe what's going on. More Democrats are being elected who hold positions that are more critical of Israel. So that's already a change from what had been effectively a bipartisan consensus of support with very few dissenting voices from within the government. Within the Republican community or party, there also seemed to be, especially recently, some new strands of resistance.
The Tucker Carlson types.
That's right. People who...
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
That's right. Yeah. Right. It seems like a strand within the Republican Party that, and maybe it's part of this America First concept of not wanting to send money overseas. I think part of it stems from some anti-Semitic perceptions that...
Oh, there's no doubt that underlies, especially some of the past statements that Taylor Greene has said, for example. Yeah.
That's right. So I think there's a lot of factors in the mix that are going to have to be teased apart in the coming months and years. But all of that means that Israel is on shakier ground, even with the United States. And that's not even to mention the fact that multiple other states that have been strong allies have been more critical and recently have come out expressing support or a recognition of Palestinian statehood, which in and of itself isn't meaningful. It doesn't mean anything on the ground immediately, but it does indicate that those states are more responsive to public opinion within their own countries that's supporting pressure upon Israel. So Israel is aware of this pressure, and I think Israeli society more generally is feeling more and more isolated and embattled in all kinds of different ways. And so that's also part of this moment 2 years out, that Israelis are kind of looking at the world and feeling even more embattled than before.
So does Israel base policy on the way Americans feel about Israel? I mean, does the shifting support for Israel, the erosion of support for Israel in the U.S. since October 7th and the military campaign in Gaza affect Israel? Does protests, like we're going to talk with No Azure for Apartheid, a spokesperson with that movement that's focused on Microsoft. Do these type of movements matter to Netanyahu or to Israel?
I think it's complicated. I think more than not, it produces a feeling of defensiveness, of saying everybody hates us, so... Right. This is the Super Sparta speech that he gave a couple of weeks ago, saying, we're this military power against the world and we're going to go it alone if we have to. So defiance. And
that also is, in the context of several more countries recognizing the Palestinian state. There is this sense that Israel is increasingly becoming isolated.
That's right. So I think the initial response to that is to say, to hell with all of them, we're going to go it alone. By the same token, Israel cannot and has never been able to go it alone. It is a small state that has always been reliant both on outside foreign aid and funding and also allyships with more powerful countries. So at the end of the day, it has to matter. So the rhetoric of we don't care has to be coupled with a sense in the political establishment that, in fact, they have to care. And something eventually has to give. And I don't know what combination of events it's going to take to get that turn to happen. But even then, I don't know what the next outcome is going to be. What I fear and expect is that we get back to a status quo that is, in fact, no better for Israel than the situation before October 7th. That it will not, in fact, have meaningfully improved its situation, at least over the long term.
Security-wise?
Security-wise, and certainly has reduced or lowered its position in terms of allyship, in terms of opportunities abroad, in terms of the opportunities that Israelis themselves can have going abroad, studying abroad, performing abroad if they're artists. So all of that is a real reduction. That's a decline in the status of Israel, without an accompanying benefit. And I think a lot of depression is going to set in and is setting in as Israelis realize that. And certainly the situation for Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, has been so deeply worsened over these last 2 years, right? It's a society largely destroyed in Gaza, which produces not just despair, but also the kind of anger that over time fuels more support for militant paths as opposed to diplomatic or nonviolent ones.
And in the West Bank, we've seen as the attention is focused on Gaza, sort of the gloves are off in terms of Israeli settlement, expansion, and the destruction of, farming and other types of infrastructure for Palestinians in the West Bank.
That's right.
Really quickly before we go, I know this is not a quick question, but these talks underway in Egypt right now about a ceasefire proposal. Bombs are continuing to fall in Gaza, but there has been somewhat of a pullback on the Gaza City offensive. So we are watching there be some responsiveness from Israel to Trump's belief and push for this ceasefire proposal. It includes the exchange of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, as well as a phased withdrawal of Israel's military and a plan for Hamas to hand over leadership. That seems to be the part that Hamas is especially balking at with their response last week. But, we have to see how things go. The feeling is, from what I can tell from the outside, like even though there have been ceasefires before, this one has like the most momentum, the most pressure from the U.S. and the Arab states, and maybe the most pressure on Netanyahu than ever before. But what is your impression of this ceasefire proposal and its chances?
Yeah, that's my impression as well. And the fact is nobody really knows because it can be torpedoed by either party. Netanyahu understands that when this war ends, likely soon after his term as prime minister will end, and then he'll face the consequences for the corruption trials he's been facing. So he has incentives to not let this end. He also has increasing incentives to come to an agreement.
He'll lose his governing coalition if this war ends, right? Because the far right, like the Smotriches, the Ben-Gvirs, they will not accept this the ceasefire proposal as is.
It seems so. At least that's what the commentariat are saying with respect to the coalition.
That's all I've got is the commentary.
Yeah, and again, I don't really know beyond that. I'm not I'm not sitting at those tables, but I do think that perhaps it's coming closer than it ever has been. Certainly, the folks in the streets, Palestinians as well as Israelis who really, really want this to end are putting a lot of hope in this, but we'll see what happens. I also know that Trump and Netanyahu have been very keen on creating good relations between Israel, the U.S., and these Gulf Arab states, which has long been a strategy that Israel and the U.S. have taken to try to create regional stability, often again and again at the expense of Palestinians. So they're really hoping that that playbook can be something that they can make use of. They're really hoping that that playbook is something that they can make use of by getting those Arab states on board and coming to a situation where economic arrangements with neighboring states will help Israel bypass the still unresolved situation with Palestine and Palestinians.
There are an estimated only about 20 hostages that are still living. The return of hostages would include the exchange of bodies. Just a final thought here about if the hostages are finally returned as part of this deal, where does Israel go? Where does it turn its attention next?
It's a good question. The return of all hostages has been so central of a focal point for many, I would say now most Israelis, and would be a significant turning point. It would no longer be that point of focus. I think at that point, I would hope that there would be a turn to actually revisiting October 7th and trying to process that trauma, also returning to the multiple tactical and strategic failures on the part of the government and the military to prevent it and to allow it to become as bad as it was on that day. I don't know. I fear that some of the same rhetorics about Gaza will return. That is, we finish this round and then hopefully the next round will not come. But when it does, we'll be ready to strike again, and that we'll be back in a pattern that is actually a frighteningly familiar pattern. But I hope some processing will occur that leads to some clarity that hasn't been able to come yet.
Liora Halperin is a professor of international studies and history and distinguished endowed chair of Jewish studies at the University of Washington. She's the director of the Interdisciplinary Ph.D. program in Near and Middle Eastern Studies. And this is a very somber anniversary that we're speaking on. I really appreciate your thoughtful responses and discussion of these incredibly difficult topics and your expertise in this area. Thank you, Liora.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. And I want to note here that our coverage of the October 7th anniversary and 2 years of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, it will include the voices of Palestinian rights activists here in the Pacific Northwest who have played a prominent role in pushing for change in how the U.S. government and American businesses approach deals with especially Israel's military. This morning, shortly after my conversation with Liora Halperin, I sat down with Hossam Nasser of the No Azure for Apartheid movement. They're a group of current and former Microsoft employees who have been protesting the company's contracts with Israel's defense forces. You heard me mention it there as I was talking to Liora. But we have a limited radio clock, and my conversation with Liora went much longer than we anticipated today. We don't want to cut Hossam's conversation short, so we're going to be airing that full interview tomorrow and exploring more about how especially tech employees in the Puget Sound region have seen some limited success in moving company policy. Microsoft has changed its policy in some limited ways in the ways that it works with Israel's defense forces. We're going to talk about that tomorrow on Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.